Thank you. But first, I want to get back to previous week's lecture. So last Thursday, I explained what affordances of social media are. So we had a discussion about what social media actually is. And then we ended with the four main affordances of social media: visibility, associations, editability, and persistence. And finally, I said, well, these affordances interact with characteristics of the organization and so can have an effect on outcomes of social media use in organizations. So that was the focus on last Thursday's lecture. On last Monday, I was talking about sociomateriality and technological determinism, but then I didn't really finish that lecture, so because there was still part of the whole debate about technological determinism and constructivism that I had to finish, resulting in, I think, one important theory that explains the interplay between technology and organizational characteristics. So before we start with theories of computer-mediated communication, I first want to finish that part of the lecture, the first lecture. And then we start with CMC theories. And if we don't make it all the way through in discussing all theories of computer-mediated communication in this lecture, not really an issue because they because this lecture kind of flows into the next lecture, well, at least my next lecture on virtual teams and virtual team interaction. So we start with what we did last week. I have to switch the PowerPoint presentations. Lecture 1A, 5. So there we are. The network organization. So blah, 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 blah. So we ended up about here. So I explained duality of technology. So there's basically a discussion about, okay, is there actually any effect of technology, or is all technology that we have only based on what we as humans want? And other people that say, well, no, technology has a huge effect on how people can communicate, how people can behave in and outside of organization. And the first one is called constructivism, so humans construct technology. And the second one is called determinism, so technology determines use of and outcomes of technology. And of course, the truth, of course, is somewhere in between. But it's useful to know the debate between these two sides. So determinism says that technology has a direct and a certain impact on the outcomes of that technology, and it does not account for human agency and context. Constructivism says the other way around. So people and context determine technology's meaning, uses, and outcomes, and its technology relativism does not account for technological features. And you observe that in organizations as well. So sometimes we don't think about technology at all. So I think I explained that last week that when you first enter a lecture room, there's a lot of physicality, a lot of physical objects that determine what you can do in that lecture room, but we're not always aware of it. On the other hand, sometimes you have a kind of utopian view of new technology, that that a new technology, a new change in technology is going to change everything. What you now see with artificial intelligence, with whole hype about artificial intelligence, virtual reality, people always say, oh, it's going to change everything. But that's never true. It's never so that a technology determines so much, because it's always in use that people find out what the use of a technology is. So people always have certain impact. So technological determinism is like it's a bit of repetition, but it's often tied to all the theories of computer-mediated communication, and it's often tied to technological innovation that say, well, this has certain effects, and it's what you often see in society. every time there's a new technology, like these examples from the time, with pornography, video games, online, privacy, internet. It's always, you always see these dystopian views of technology. Technology is an autonomous force. Technology is not being neutral but negative, having many effects on how we use technology. And when I did my PhD on how teens use social media. It wasn't called social media then, but it was called Microsoft Messenger and Hives, even before Facebook. There was a huge panic from schools and parents about the consequences of these new social media for teenagers, especially because it's always consequences for not you but for others. And they were worried, well, will they have any friends left because they have so many weak ties or so many non-friends on Facebook who they call friends. Will they have any real friends left? Will they do their homework, or will they only stay and chat online? And I always have to say, well, it's not going to be that bad. It's not that there is a technology that determines how children will use the technology. It's because teenagers want to communicate with each other that we have this technology in the first place. So the thing that you want to have as a teenager is you want to be popular, and you want to have as many friends as you can, especially if you're an early teen. And those technologies are just made to gratify that need. So it's not a matter of technology determining the outcomes. It's a matter of people's needs determining the technology. But always in technological determinism, you see a kind of an idea that technology determines certain outcomes as an autonomous force that affects people's thoughts and behaviors. So it's often dystopian versus no. It's often dystopian versus utopian. So like I said, there's moral panics. People are afraid that technology has a really huge impact on society. But it's also oftentimes very utopian, especially in organizations. So one of the main reasons for organizations to adopt a new technology, so not only social media, but any technology, is that organizations have the idea that once they have that technology in place, that everything will change. So that's a more of utopian view of technology, but it's still technological determinism. So like the Sankers and Poole say, once the technology is applied, there's a belief that it will automatically bring productivity, efficiency, satisfaction to individual employees and organizations. And that's what you have with social media in the workplace. So many organizations implement Slack or Microsoft Teams now, or whatever application, because they hope and they believe that once they have that in place, people can start communicating. People will be able to start forming communities, and they will start to share knowledge in an organization, and they will be more committed to the organization because they can have access to other people in the organization anywhere. And that's, of course, never the case. Then you see that technology, if implemented correctly in an organization, often is accompanied by other changes in an organization, like you have a change in process and structure in people. But as often technology is seen as, an agent of change that is going to disrupt organizations and going to be able to do work completely differently. So in this more utopian sense, what you again especially see in organization studies is that technology consists of structures that overcome human weaknesses. So it structures human action, and therefore any change in the organization results from technological change. So I have an example of determinism, but also constructivism. So I think this is a nice example of the interplay between technology and human action. So it's not a social media example, those come later, but this is an example of a timesheet. I don't know if you have any experience working in an organization where you have to keep track of time. But in many organizations, you have to keep track of what you do. So you have to fill in a timesheet. And I once worked at because it was a research agency. We did a lot of assignments, conducting online research, for example, for a lot of different clients. And every Friday, we had to fill in a timesheet. So with how many hours we worked on which project, so they could bill the client. And it's quite deterministic a timesheet. There's not much freedom in dealing with the technology. So you simply have to say, oh, well, this week from Monday 9 o'clock until Monday 1 o'clock, I worked on project X. Sorry. Yes. I gave so many lectures last week that I forgot where I said it. So there's not much leeway in filling in the timesheet, but you see that everyone filled in a timesheet by Friday afternoon, and they just filled in whatever, so that project has a lot of hours left. So I just bill 20 hours on that project. So you see that even with a technology that is as deterministic as a timesheet, it's very deterministic when you have to fill it in at a certain point of time. You have to fill in hours and projects, and that's it. But even then, you see that people have a lot of agency left, have ways of misusing that technology, and that is human agency. That is constructivism at work. So although the timesheet forces me to use the technology in a certain way, I have to fill it in by Friday afternoon, it still allows me some leeway of filling it in the way I want, and filling it in basically the other way around. So first thinking about billable hours and then filling in a timesheet in instead of the other way around as it's supposed to. So sorry for repeating myself, but I think it remains a nice example of the interplay between technology and human agency. So therefore, what about human agency? So it's people that develop technology, it's people behind the software who develop it. So it's not that technology suddenly originates. It's people who select and appropriate. I'll explain what appropriate means in a second. Technology. People use and adapt technology. So the problem of determinism is that there is too big a role for technology. So they cannot explain the different uses and effects of the same technology. So for example, in one organization, Slack works perfectly to work together, and in another organization, it doesn't. To give you a very specific example, in our university, we basically use Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And we as teachers and scientists, we basically use Zoom all the time, and we never use Microsoft Teams. Because for us, Zoom is flexible, it's easier to use, but it's also because we're used to it. And it's easier to work with larger groups of people at Zoom. If we have to work with Microsoft Teams, for us, it has a kind of a formal air to it. So Microsoft Teams is for the policy things. It's for one-on-one conversations. For many other departments in the organization, that's completely different. So especially for support staff, they use Microsoft Teams for everything. And for them, it's a standard way of doing things. So they use Microsoft Teams for, well, especially now in Corona times, for Friday evening meetings and having drinks together via Microsoft meetings. They use them for informal conversations, for formal meetings. So they have a completely different idea and a completely different outcome and use of Microsoft Teams than we as a teaching staff do. And that has only partly to do with the objective characteristics of the technology, but has also to do for a large part with how we just are used to working with the technology. So, and that's appropriation, how we have appropriated technology to in the organization to fit our needs. So even within the same organization, a technology can be seen completely different. And that's just not something that determinism can explain. So because according to determinism, once you know the characteristics of the technology, they should have fixed effects. So, and that may seem obvious, but you have to realize that if you think of a technology, that your immediate reflex and the immediate reflex of many people in organizations and just many people in general is to think of the effects of technology on something and never think of the internet. So on the other hand, you have the hard social constructivism who say that technology is not autonomous, it's neutral. So it's kind of, yeah, so they say technology is a text. So you have kind of a blank slate, and we determine how exactly we use the technology. So you cannot say that the technology works in an organization. You cannot say what a technology will finally be used for. People have to use it first, and only then can you determine how it can be used in an organization. That's the example of WhatsApp and text messaging. It was not designed at all for social communication. It was designed for technical only communication, but people used it for something completely different. So the text messaging was invented by the users and then adapted so that it fit users' needs. So by adding emojis, etc. But of course, okay, my timesheet. But of course, the truth is in between. So of course, technology sometimes has, sometimes guides behavior. There's just some things you can and cannot do with a certain technology. And sometimes you see that the technology has certain effects. There are some common effects that we observe in many communication technologies. So the solution is sociomateriality. So they say, well, it's the interplay between determinism and constructivism. So technology has certain characteristics. People learn these characteristics, then they use them in ways that people could not imagine beforehand. And the technology is adapted again, etc., etc. So the problem of social materiality is that it's a bit vague. So it's more of a philosophical idea about humans interact with technology than something concrete. Therefore, based on the whole social materiality approach, you have more practical theories that offer a more concrete view of how technology and people interact. And last week we discussed one, affordances, and now I want to discuss adaptive structuration. So affordances is social materiality at work. Affordances says, well, you do observe that people do certain fixed things with technology, and so that they may have certain characteristics, like the visibility of many social media. But it's not a given that we find is important. That the visibility of social media is something that we determine together is important in social media, and therefore it has become a kind of characteristic of many social media. So it's not an objective characteristic. It's also not something that is not in the technology because it's built in the technology. I'm visible now for you. It's in between. So that's the social materiality of the affordance approach. And that's why I think affordances are a very good way of looking at social media. But we also have appropriation, adaptive structuration. And that's the other theory I want to discuss. But first, let me give an example of social materiality in practice. I don't know if you've heard, but I think it was 2 years ago or so that Microsoft launched an artificial intelligence that you would tweet with, which would then learn from the tweets of people and would get smarter. So Microsoft says, Tay tweets, he was called Tay, and the more you chat with Tay, the smarter she gets. So within a day, Tay turned into some kind of weird right-wing Hitler-loving sex robot, because of course, this is what happens if you ask the internet to do anything. So people started experimenting with Tay. So they of course people say things about sex and extreme things to such a chatbot to see how the chatbot will react. And then the algorithm used all the input to form kind of a personality and then talk back. So I think it's a nice example of social materiality. Now you have a chatbot with artificial intelligence, which is programmed to learn from users, and it's programmed with a certain fixed set of rules that allow the chatbot to reply and then learn. But ultimately, how the chatbot turned out is what we did. Well, the people tweeting with the chatbot. So they gave input in such a way that the chatbot developed a certain type of personality and ideology. So in the case of determinism, a chatbot would have a fixed effect on how people tweet with a chatbot. In case of constructivism, we will be completely free in doing with the chatbot whatever we want, but it's kind of in between. The algorithms in the chatbot kind of determine how the chatbot interprets information, but we determine the input that the chatbot receives. Another example is this one, which is actually quite terrible if you think about it. White hand with a monocular, whatever it is, maybe to read temperature or something like that. Definitely not a gun. So the image recognition algorithm, if the hand is white, thinks it's a hand. And the monocular, if the hand is black, the algorithm thinks it's a gun. Another example from software called Depixelator. It's where you can upload a picture, a very pixely picture, like really zoomed in. And there is an algorithm which is based on thousands or millions of other pictures that kind of tries to find similar pictures and then put the pixelated picture back together in higher resolution. And to see if you're still paying attention, who is the person on the left who is pixelated? Yeah, not Trump. Yeah, it's Obama. So for us, it's very easy to observe it's Obama. We immediately recognize him. But the computer, or at least the AI, thinks it's a white man. And that's because so it's the picture on the left is kind of a formal LinkedIn profile picture-like picture, blank background, zoomed in. And then if you think about most of the pictures that look like that picture is of white dudes. So the algorithm takes all these pictures and thinks, well, must be white. Similarly, based on all the information about what we see in the news, all the photos in the news, etc., the algorithm thinks, a thing you can hold in your hand which looks a bit like a kind of a gun in a black hat, must be a gun, which is terrible, but also a good example of sociomateriality. So on the one hand, it's the algorithm forcing an outcome upon us. So it's rules in the algorithm which determines what the algorithm comes up with. On the other hand, the technology is completely dependent on the input that is provided by us, by society as a whole. So it's not that the algorithm is faulty, that the algorithm says that someone who is black is automatically holding a gun. It's us. It's us as a society who have triggered that stereotype. And the algorithm just reinforces it. Because the algorithm does not know anything. So again, it's the interplay between characteristics of an algorithm like that and the input we give. Okay, these are most all societal examples. Yeah. It can also be based on the one who programmed the algorithm, absolutely. So the one who programmed the algorithm, they ultimately determine, especially in the case of the pixelator, for example, they determine the input going into the algorithm. So they, for example, just, they download a couple of millions of photos from a stock website and feed those photos in the algorithm. But then still those photos are probably mostly white. So it's because of our input, but it's also kind of a responsibility of the programmer to think about these issues. On the other hand, should these issues and should these discussions be the sole responsibility of the one programming the algorithm? I think not. So it should be like a wider discussion on how these artificial intelligences work and what the pros and cons are and how they can become better, and maybe less biased. So it's so if you look at the whole artificial intelligence discussion, it's an interesting example of like the interplay of technology, but also a lot of choices that people make going into that technology that ultimately determine the outcomes. Because you can imagine that if an algorithm like the top left one only gives back like biased results, that you reinforce that bias in society. So maybe you want to cut it out, or maybe not. But ultimately, that's not something you can solve with technology. You should solve that with, thinking about that as humans. So again, interplay between technology and us feeding the technology. So adaptive structuration is a sociomaterial theory, which is specifically focused on organization. So in the example of the artificial intelligence, it's more a societal discussion, but you can also look at technology from within an organizational perspective. And adaptive structuration is already quite old. It's from 1994. but I think it's still pretty relevant. So it's basically sociomateriality on a micro level in an organization. So the basic premise of the theory is, okay, they call it advanced information technologies, but you might as well call it social media or whatever name for technology we currently have. They say they have certain structures, but they have to blend in with existing organizational practices. So organizational change may need time. Still sounds vague, but it's pretty simple. So technologies provide certain structures. So they provide rules, procedures, ways of doing things. Basically, like the programmer who builds the algorithm, programmers build technology, and a technology provides certain structure. For example, if you look at Slack, social media and organization, it's quite similar to a combination between project management software, Facebook, and WhatsApp. But it provides structures to work on projects. So you can add people to a Slack channel, and that Slack channel acts much like a Facebook group. So you can give updates, you can chat together, you can share documents together. People can click on you and read your profile, and on that profile it says what project you're working on, what your expertise is in the organization. So much like an internal social media application. But that provides certain structural features. It provides structures for you to use. It provides the ability to create a profile. It provides the ability to create groups, channels. So the technology allows or consists of structural features. Those are the capabilities, like the affordances of the technology. And those are really like the structure, like the technological characteristics of the affordance of the technology. But the technology also has and it's a bit of a vague word, but the technology also has something called a spirit, like how the technology is presented to people, which provides a kind of obvious way of using it, which is also a kind of affordance. Okay, that's still a bit vague. I always give the example of my mobile phone. So if you look at your screen, so if you unpack a new mobile phone, it always looks like this. I hope you can see, but always on the bottom of a mobile phone are those buttons for quick access. And those buttons below, so on the bottom of your mobile phone screen, those are structural features. So whatever you do, you must hack your mobile phone, but whatever you do, those 4 or 5 buttons, that banner with quick access buttons, cannot be changed. So that's a structural feature of the technology. On the other hand, when you first turn on a new mobile phone, you see that there are certain buttons that are always there. I think it's always phone, messages, settings, and the browser of the phone you have. That's the spirit. So that's the expectations of the programmer, what you may think is most important. So the first thing you of course do is change that. So you probably you will have WhatsApp or maybe Instagram or Snapchat in the banner, so you can access that quickly. But that's the spirit. So the programmer actually programs it in such a way that it's not in the technology, but it's kind of an idea that the programmers think, okay, this is how you should use the technology. And that's the spirit of the technology. So the general intent with regard to values and goals underlying a set of features, officially. So basically, a technology has certain features, certain capabilities, or affordances, as you might better call them, which is structural and spirit. So the technology has certain features. But that structuration says how those features are used is really dependent on the organization. So it depends on the tasks, on the organization, so the environment. It depends on the small group system, so on the specific people using the technology. So the team and the knowledge of the team, the social norms. So they interact with the structural features and so determine the outcome. And the interaction between the structural features of the technology and all the characteristics of the organization, of the task, of the people using it, that's called structuration. So officially, when the social structure is provided by the technology and the other sources, the organizational sources, are brought into action, so when people start using it, then adaptation of the technology may occur and people may use and reuse parts of the technology to finally determine the use and the outcomes of technology. And that process is called appropriation. And that explains why people use technology in a different way. So, for example, when most of you email me or send a message via Canvas, it's somewhat formal. It's dear professor, or if you're a bit less informal, you say dear Alex. And then you have your question, and then you say thank you, and then your name. So you use the features of the technology, so it's asynchronous. You can think about it a bit, how you write your message, and you can send it then. So you use email or the inbox in Canvas in a certain way. For me, the technology is completely similar. So it's also asynchronous, it's editable, only I use it completely different. So I do it as the professor does. So if someone has a question, I just do Control-R with reply, and I say yes, no, read the manual, and that's it. And if I have more than 5 seconds left, I may say cheers, Alex, but that's it. So I'm a lot less formal in email than many of you are. That's one of the perks of being a professor, that you can just be rude. But it also depends on the specific supervisor you have and the specific teacher. What it's to say is to show you that the way that we use technology, so the way that we use email, which is the same technology for everyone, that the way we also, efficient, yeah, that way that we use the technology, the structural features are the same for everyone, but the way we appropriate it depends on who you are in the organization, on your team, etc. Another example is WhatsApp groups. So all WhatsApp groups are the same. They have the same structural features. So you have a group, you can switch them to silent or not. They are so WhatsApp is still asynchronous, but it has more synchronicity than email because you can see if someone has read the message. It's also editable. So a WhatsApp group has certain structural features of the technology. But ultimately, it depends on the people in the WhatsApp group, how such a group is used. So This will probably sound familiar, but in some WhatsApp groups, there are certain rules for starting a conversation and stopping a conversation. So you have to specifically say, well, hi, how are you, and then start a conversation. In other groups, you can just start or continue a conversation that you previously stopped. Some groups are more formal, some groups are more informal, and those ways of using a group are appropriated. So we use the technological features. WhatsApp is it's a way of getting into quick contact with your colleagues or another group of people. But then how you do that is actually determined in use. So in a workplace, you see many different uses of WhatsApp groups. And here you see WhatsApp groups that are only there during office hours. You have WhatsApp groups that are more fluid, so they're used for private and business topics. And you have WhatsApp group purely for private topics. So those characteristics of the people using it and the characteristics of the organization determine an outcome like that. And you see that there is kind of in the beginning of if you have a new WhatsApp group, kind of in the beginning of the group, people kind of subtly determine the rules of those groups. So when someone posts a joke and gets no reply at all, then it kind of points towards a more formal type of group. If people reply quickly, it is another type of group. So minor cues in the beginning of an interaction determine those outcomes. Well, I think that's a very interesting topic. So it basically means that there's a kind of a structuration process going on, and that's why it's called adaptive structuration. So people appropriate the technology, so they take the affordances of the technology and fit them to their needs. And the technology has certain properties, has certain features or affordances, but they interact with the characteristics of the organization. Finally, if we use the technology as it's meant to be, we call an appropriation faithful. So we use the technology as intended. If we use the technology in a different way than intended, we call it unfaithful. So it's not. The technology is not meant for that, but we use it differently. So that's faithful and unfaithful appropriation. So finally, this is so you don't have to learn this by heart, of course, but this is an example of a model that the scientists and Paul made in their study. And here you see all the sources of influence in the technology. So only here in the top left, P1, these are the structures of the technology. So the structural features, the restrictiveness, well, whatever the spirit of the technology is, what you can use it for. But it interacts with the organization, the task, it interacts with the group, and then in using it, it's finally determined what you can do with it, and then it has certain outcomes. So you see that thinking about social media and organizations and thinking about technology in general is actually quite complicated, because you continuously have to think about the technology and the organizational characteristics. And again, like I said before, that's basically the whole premise of this course, to let you think about technology on the one hand, of people using the technology on the other hand. So in short, I think that adaptive structuration is a very good way, because they specifically they say something specific about the sources of structure, the affordances of the technology and the characteristics of the organization, and they explain how they may interact. So I think the adaptive structuration and the affordance approach in general, who say, well, what we see as characteristics of social media is actually determined in use, so we find visibility important. I think those are actually two very concrete theories with which you can study the use of social media in the workplace. And that's, I think, yeah, that's all I wanted to say about these theories. So which means we can switch to the actual topics of today's lecture, which is the CMC theories. I think I have them here. But I suggest that we first have a short break. Let's say that we like 5 minutes or so, that we start at 5 to 12 again, so I can get a glass of water. Okay? Okay, see you in a bit. So, okay. Let's continue the lecture and basically start with a lecture finally. So, theories of computer-mediated communication are basically if you look at theories we have of social media, the most important theory of social media in general is the affordance approach to social media. So those characteristics or affordance that social media has in terms of visibility, etc. Which, as I said, interact with characteristics of the organization and people, and so determine certain outcomes. What social media, those affordance approach of social media actually doesn't take into account is the actual communication aspect of social media. So especially, so we think of social media mostly in terms of things you do basically alone. So you update your profile, you maintain a list of connections, you can send messages which are then received by others. But they don't really take into account the whole communication aspect of social media. While in organizations and also outside, if you look at WhatsApp and Snapchat, etc., a large part of the social media use is direct or near direct interaction with others. And that's where CMC theories come in. And they're not specifically social media related, but are a large part of social media. And they have been around since the, well, I'd say they've been around since the 60s. Because of course we've been using communication technologies for a long time to talk to each other. So starting with the telephone, for example, and even the telex, and even something like synchronous chat has been around since the 50s. Only it was on paper, so you could type something in on it looked like a typewriter, and someone at the other side would see your text messages printed directly on a ribbon of paper. It was used in news agencies and in the military in the 50s. So computer-mediated communication has been around a bit longer than social media. Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think, yeah, officially that it has certain characteristics of social media. Yeah, it's mediated communication. So it is social media. Although it doesn't have a lot of the other characteristics of social media, so it's not really editable, because it's like a typewriter. What you type gets sent immediately to the other side, and it's not about association. So it's more, so it is mediated interaction, but it's not social media in terms of editability, and also not in terms of the whole association part. That is it's more one-on-one conversation. So those theories have been around since ages, and I think they're quite interesting to see what they have to say about social media. Many of them are deterministic, so they explain the effects of computer-mediated communication in terms of, okay, we have certain characteristics of the technology, they have certain effects. But later on, you see that there is kind of also an integrative perspective, like we see in adaptive structuration. So we started out with technological determinism, then you have social determinism, and now we're somewhere in the middle. The theory started out with focus on the cues left out, and we now look more at the cues that are offered online. Effects go from simple to complex, and actually there was, I think it's quite interesting, there was actually a lot of research in the 80s and early 90s into group decision support systems. So those were, I think, the precursor of social media and organizations, where you had certain systems in place that people could just use a desktop computer to chat with each other in a more or less anonymous way. They thought, that's why it's called group decision support systems, that those settings would help people in meetings, so people could be more honest and could be more creative because they were separated from the rest of the group. Well, now we look more not specifically group decision support systems, but more at integrated systems like enterprise social media as a whole, with which you can do, of course, a lot more than only supporting decision making. So basically, all theories focus on, okay, what cues are available in computer-mediated communication, so in online settings, and how do they affect how people can interact with each other. And if you look at the overview article by Walther et al., you actually see that there are many CMC theories, like there are maybe a dozen or so. And I want to focus on basically these theories that are red. Maybe if I have time left on the ones that are pink, but I don't think so. And already it's like 6 theories, but basically, if you take the first 3, they're all about social presence. So they can all be, they all have like a common denominator, which is referred to as social presence theories. So let's start with that one. These have been around since the 70s. So the seminal paper on social presence theories from 1976, which is 44 years ago. So it's a long time ago. But you'll see that social presence theory still plays a huge role in when people think about the effects of technology. Even, for example, social presence theory is the reason I'm using a webcam right now. Because social presence theory argues, and they say, computer-mediated communication is inferior to face-to-face communication. Because in face-to-face communication, in face-to-face communication, you have many different channels. It's synchronous. You have like a high-res image of the other. You're physically close. So you have voice. You have non-verbal interactions. You have proxemics. So how far away are you from the one you're talking to? You can even have touch or something like that. Yeah. So thanks. Yeah. For me, those abbreviations are so common that I sometimes forget to explain them. So CMC, computer-mediated communication, FTF, face-to-face. So if you compare face-to-face communication to computer-mediated communication, especially if you think of the 70s, but even now, there's a lack of bandwidth. There are just some things that we cannot communicate efficiently and quickly using computer-mediated communication. I cannot see you, so I cannot see if you pay attention or are bored. I cannot pay attention to your non-verbal language to help me in my lecture. I just have to zoom and pay attention to the chat to see if you still find this somewhat interesting. So we just lose certain channels in computer-mediated communication compared to face-to-face, so it has less bandwidth. But the theory, social presence theory also says, well, there's also a more psychological component. So because there's less bandwidth, there is not so much awareness of the other. So that means, they say, that computer-mediated communication is more distant, more psychologically distant than face-to-face communication. So therefore, it does not allow for interpersonal relationships because it lacks the bandwidth and it lacks the warmth and friendliness, so the social presence actually of the interaction. And therefore, those theories say, if you look at computer-mediated communication, it's mostly fit for task-oriented in communication, and not for in organizations, not for communication for which you need warmth and friendliness, for which you need to communicate emotions. So, for example, in negotiations, in decision making, in job interviews, CMC is not well suited. So they also say the more bandwidth you add, the better. So if you have email, it's very low in richness. It lacks presence. But if you then make it synchronous, for example, in a WhatsApp interaction, it already has a bit more bandwidth, so it's a bit more present. If you then add audio video, like we're doing now, then it mirrors face-to-face even more. It's almost close to face-to-face. You still have that psychological distance, but we do have non-verbal communication to an extent. We have voice. So they say the more bandwidth you add, the more it's like face-to-face, the better. So the more able you are to communicate emotions, the more able you are to do complicated tasks using computer-mediated communication. So we get back to that later on, because you can immediately observe that if you look at how you use, for example, WhatsApp, that lacks a lot of bandwidth. It's not synchronous, it has no video. It does have emojis nowadays, but you use it for rich communication, or you can use it to break up with a boy or girlfriend. Let's see if you use it for that. Sorry. Edit. Why? Okay, bear with me for a moment. I don't know what it's called in it. Okay, so let's see if you use a very low impression communication technology for something which is very rich. So have you ever broken up with someone using WhatsApp or Snapchat, whatever? Or maybe you were on the other receiving end, have been broken up with, I don't know if that's correct in English, using WhatsApp. So it's anonymous, so go ahead. Okay. It's not as bad as I thought. I thought it would be the other way around. It would be like 70-30 or so. But you see, it's still 30% who did. And if you then look how you use WhatsApp in real life, you use it to have very emotional conversations, and so 30% to break up with or being broken up with. You use it to fight with someone. You use it to have cyber sex. So all kinds of things which are very which require emotions and difficult forms of interaction. But according to social presence theory, this would not be possible with a thing like WhatsApp, because it just lacks the bandwidth. I think it's also an interesting example of appropriation, because you see that, and of structuration, because you see that text messaging was text only. Then we invented emoticons, so parentheses and brackets, etc., to convey emotions. Then someone in Japan thought, oh well, we can also program something that you can type in those emoticons directly, and that you see a smiley face. And so the emojis were born in Japan. So then the technology took something we invented and programmed it into the technology. So WhatsApp became, or text messaging became, richer and richer and richer. But still, it lacks a lot of the bandwidth of face-to-face communication. So you see that this theory doesn't always fit the reality, but sometimes it does. Because what's interesting about this theory is that it also kind of explains what often happens on the internet. Because they attached a lot of consequences to that reduced social presence. So they say, according to the theories, especially the lack of context theory, they say, well, if you miss all those non-verbal channels, if you're not physically close and not feel socially close, it results to a thing like de-individuation. So if you're not available, you cannot regulate the interaction, so you cannot see how someone reacts, you cannot observe the emotions of others. You are less aware of other people. So so the theory says, if you cannot see other people, you kind of get the impression that the people you communicate with are less like people and more like robots, or just less people-like. And it may enhance attention you give to the context of the interaction. And more about that in a later theory. But they basically say, well, if you lack that psychological presence, so if you lack those non-verbal cues that you can use to observe and communicate emotion, and if it also lacks the psychological distance, so that you may see other people less human-like and more object-like, that may lead to de-individuation. And de-individuation means that you kind of have a reduced sense of others as real people, and that you have a reduced sense of self, a reduced sense of self-awareness. And self-awareness means that you pay attention to who you are and the consequences of your actions. So you have less attention to others and to the consequences of your actions. And they say this leads to, well, basically what you see here: disinhibition, negative behavior, resistance to influence. I'll come back to that. So they say it leads to disinhibition. So because you have the impression that other people are more like objects than real people, so there's psychological distance. You have the anonymity of the interaction, which for yourselves makes it easier to say what you want, because you, for one, you're anonymous, and others you cannot be held accountable. But you can also, others can also not see you, and the other way around. So that makes it easier to be disinhibited. And of course, this is what you observe on, well, look at any comment section on YouTube or Reddit discussion. That is what you observe. So because people are not accountable, because it's all kind of anonymous, you see that it's kind of, people become disinhibited. So it becomes easier for them to just, say what they want to say in a bold fashion. Okay, question is, wouldn't that theory assume that all people can read social cues anyway? Because if people can't read these cues, does it also affect them in the same way? I don't really understand if I understand the second part of the question. So no, so the theory does not assume that people can read these social cues anyway. The theory does assume that people cannot read these cues because you don't have access to that information, because it's, it's relatively anonymous. You don't have the bandwidth. You don't see others. Other people don't know who you are in many instances, so you don't have those cues. Later on, we see that people are actually very good at still being able to read social cues, even in a in a chat like I see now. Second one is, does the lack of non-verbal cues lead to those points, or does the individuation lead to them? Yeah, it's kind of like a multi-step process. So you have a lack of non-verbal cues. You have the anonymity of the interaction. So just the fact that people don't know who you are in real life. Those lead to de-individuation. So de-individuation. So those first things, those lack of non-verbal cues and anonymity, those are characteristics of the technology. So they allow you to be anonymous. They disallow non-verbal cues. That leads to de-individuation, and de-individuation is a psychological state. It's you feeling anonymous and you feeling more safe to say whatever you want. So de-individuation is a psychological state you're in, and disinhibition is the behavior accompanying that. So disinhibition and negative behavior, those are types of behavior. So disinhibition is just saying what you want up front without thinking about the consequences, what you do when you're drunk. So lack of non-verbal cues, anonymity, etc., characteristics of the technology, de-individuation, psychological state, disinhibition, negative behavior, etc., outcome. Is that not everyone uses social cues in the same extent anyway. No, that's absolutely true, and we will see that later on, that actually we get a lot of information from even from textual cues. So if I type this, or I type this, or no. So these things have completely different meaning. So we pay attention to those minor minor aspects of the interaction that we can observe, and use these cues to form impressions of others. So we are good at paying attention to social cues, but we don't do it in the same way. So we do it in different ways, absolutely. But so there's a lot of things you can comment on these social presence theories, but they do have a point. So it kind of explains the whole anonymity and lack of non-verbal cues part. Kind of explains the why people behave in such a way on YouTube comment sections. Later on, we'll see that there is another theory which may be able to explain it even better. But the interesting thing is, according to this theory, they say, well, it may lead to negative effects, negative behavior, disinhibition. But they say, on the other hand, you can use that in organizations because people become more resistant to influence. So, for example, if you're anonymous and you have to chat while your boss is in the same chat discussion, it's easier to say what's on your mind. They also, that's why those theories also say people become more equal because everyone can just say what they want and there is no hierarchy or leadership. And they also say people become more rational because you don't observe those emotions of others, and because you are also maybe less self-aware, it's easier to focus on the task at hand. So basically they say, well, those technology can have negative effects, but also positive effects on people in organizations. So they say the cues correspond with functions. So if you don't have nonverbal cues, there are just certain things you can and cannot do. And they say CMC cannot perform social functions. So they specifically say there's no way that you can have a rich emotional conversation with a chat interaction. The weird thing is that if you think about it a bit further, and if you think of the way that you use WhatsApp, then you immediately see that this theory is not always correct. If you think of how people use technology in organizations, then you see that it's highly influential even today, especially in organizational literature, because it makes intuitive sense. It's very simple to say, okay, if you don't have all the things you have in face-to-face conversation, it makes it more difficult to communicate. And especially always those arguments are accompanied by that nonsense like 80% of communication is nonverbal, and other bullshit like that. So they say, well, therefore you need webcams, therefore you need virtual teams there or video conferencing, therefore you need virtual reality. So every time you see a technology innovation, so we need virtual reality because then we can be in a virtual room together. That's always based on social presence theory. It's always based on the stereotype that if we make it look like face-to-face interaction, then it works. Maybe a bit exaggerated, not always, but it's still highly influential, and still, because it's very intuitive, we still think like that often when we think about technology in organizations. Okay. So, like I said, theory has been thoroughly debunked, and so they observe those results because they mostly study CMC in organizations, and they mostly study, task groups, which are really task focused. But nowadays you see that there are more theories that are able to explain it a bit better. I want to spend 2 slides on media richness theory, and I think then the lecture is already at its end. Media richness theory is a social presence theory. So it also says that, well, you can define technology in terms of bandwidth, and there are things you can and cannot do when you have a certain amount of bandwidth. So again, they say there is a match between the task and the technology, and they say more difficult tasks with higher equivocality, for which you need more information, so they're ambiguous or emotional, you need richer media in order to be efficient. So simply, if you have a difficult task or negotiation, for example, you need as much bandwidth as possible to do the task correctly. On the other hand, they say, well, if you have something very simple to communicate, like planning, then it's a bit overkill to have a video conference, because then a poorer medium with less bandwidth is just as okay. So you could basically just send out an email. So they're basically still based on social presence theory, only they were the first one who said, well, there's actually an interaction between the task and between the technology, and that determines the outcome. So it was the first theory that took into account characteristics of the task and the technology. So they say if you look at media, you have bandwidth, so rich versus poor. So the richer, the more bandwidth, the more like face-to-face. And they say you have 4 characteristics of rich media. Multiplicity of cue systems, so bandwidth, so non-verbal, audio, video. Immediate feedback, so is it synchronous or not? Personalization, so can you use the technology in a way to personalize messages, or is it more formal? And language variety, so can you use the complete language you want with jokes and tone variations, etc., or is it a more formal type of language? Those latter 2 are not really important anymore, but the bandwidth and the synchronicity, so the availability of immediate feedback, is still something that defines many communication technologies. So we now have a lot of bandwidth, and there's also immediate feedback. At least you can see me and hear me synchronously. You, on the other hand, have a bit more freedom, a bit less social presence, because I can only see what you type in the chat. And they say, well, if you have a lot of bandwidth, if you're synchronous, if it's an informal medium, then the medium is richer, and then you can communicate difficult messages. So if you look at the technologies on the left-hand side, you see that a letter or email, or it's from the 80s, so fax machine, is quite low in richness, and face-to-face video conference is quite high. Then you have complexity of the information you need to communicate, and there's like a bandwidth, a band of effective communication in between. So if you have a very complex thing to communicate, like a lecture, maybe you should choose a medium that's quite rich, and do not try to do this by email, but also the other way around. So do not plan in a video conference if you have to make an appointment. So the first theory that discussed the interplay between task and technology. I don't think we're gonna do this one. So I have 3 other theories I want to discuss, but I think we could better do, because they kind of match nicely to the virtual team part of the lecture. So I think we could better do this next week. Oh, and I see that we have 1 minute to go in the lecture anyways. So we quit here, and next week is Joost's turn with social media and employee commitments. The week after that, I'll be back with virtual teams and the rest of this lecture. And I'll see half of you on Thursday in the workgroup sessions. So if you have not uploaded a paper yet, I think you have to do it quickly, or had to do it half an hour ago, I think. So I'll see you Thursday. So for now, thank you very much, and see you Thursday.
Alex, okay. Alex, can I add something for Thursday? Please upload the article, but then